Let me begin with a very warm thank you to Dr. Jonathan Peary and to Manor College in hosting this excellent and timely gathering. I am truly honored to be with you and your esteemed panelists, whose knowledge on the militarization of Crimea is not only well respected, but also highly accurate. The predictable evolution on the occupation of Crimea, now in its 7th year, would eventually bring on board a much-needed analysis from those who possess military and defense acumen. We can safely assume that Russia did not occupy Crimea so it can give it away. The fact is that the militarization of the occupied Crimean Peninsula of Ukraine by the Russian Federation clearly reveals the global dimensions with all its ramifications. The discussion so far has revealed the increasing urgency to act and that the international community can no longer afford to wait. The more time it takes to address the issue, the more difficult it becomes. While I must admit I am somewhat 35 feet away from the topic of military nuclear missiles, their individual component carriers, anti-craft missiles, etc., but I can say most assuredly that we understand the lay of the Ukrainian land. It is my thinking to understand the occupation of Crimea and Donbass in its fullest context, we need only to take a look at the physical lay of the land with its surrounding navigational waters and see that the Crimean Peninsula is one of the most important geostrategic locations. With its navigational access to the Sea of Azov, which runs into the Black Sea, across the Bosporus Straits in Turkey, which then enters into the Sea of Marmara, onto the Dardanelles Straits, then flows out into the Aegean and Mediterranean Sea. This is right in the neighborhood of EU nations. During the Soviet era, Western Europe and Turkey in particular were continually at the edge of their seat in fear of the then Soviet Union would use Crimea as a springboard entry into Europe and the Middle East, thereby control the waterways. It has been said that the post-Soviet geopolitical fault line runs through Ukraine and lands in Crimea. It is the one place in the region which has the highest Russian ethnic majority. 58% is the approximate number. So today we find ourselves in the 7th year on the fictitious referendum which took place in March 2014 with Russia's attempts to legalize its illegal control over the Crimean Peninsula of Ukraine. And that is why we are here today. With Russian boots and military on the ground, the ramifications and militarization of the Crimean Peninsula is manifold. Imperialistic ambitions and militarization has laid down a fertile ground for human rights violations against those who oppose the occupation. I would like to add, if you will, a human aspect, a humanitarian human rights aspect with respect to the militarization of the occupation. As Crimea is increasingly becoming more and more isolated, thereby providing opportunities for blatant persecution of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainian activists. International community thinks it's quiet in Crimea. Supposedly, Crimean residents have unanimously voted to join the Russian Federation. This image that everyone is happy so-called success in public is truly inconsistent with the backstage fear of anxiety, repression, abductions, disappearances, and murders. Windows of homes are boarded up, children are escorted to school, while the fact remains on the dire situation of Crimean Tatars and Ukrainian activists whose lives have been profoundly ruptured. Freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of belief, freedom of peaceful assembly are all being violated with the increase of militarization. The compulsory conscription for military service in the Russian army. Many youth have left the peninsula for the mainland to avoid the Russian army. And based on the human rights organizations in Ukraine, approximately 50,000 Crimeans have left the peninsula into the mainland Ukraine. There is no repose for the people in Crimea. They do not know when the next raid will happen, whose house, whose brother, whose husband, whose son is going to be abducted or arrested. 177 children of political prisoners in occupied Crimea are growing up without their fathers. One might ask, why are they being arrested? And to start with, I would like to highlight just one or two examples for the reason of these arrests. Let's take the first prisoner group, which are the journalists or civic journalists, human rights defenders. In particular, Marlon Süleyman is a member of the Crimean Solidarity Group, and this group came to being as an organic, civic, conscious group of people who simply sought to support the families of Crimean Tatars who are falsely imprisoned. It is an unprecedented example of courageous mass resistance to the recurrent repression in a peaceful and nonviolent manner. Its members are Ukrainians, Crimean Tatars, and other ethnic origin and religious denomination. Marlon, who is imprisoned on a fabricated charge for peaceful single-person ticket, is charged with extremism. He is part of a group who are forcibly imprisoned as journalists and human rights defenders, along with Seyran Salih, Emir Hussein Kuku, Timur Ibrahim, Server Mustafayev. Arrests are made as pretext to silence those who speak against the injustice perpetrated on the political prisoners. So these activists then themselves become political prisoners. So the cycle continues. For the Crimean Tatar parents, they were totally foreign to this charge in linking their children with extremism and terrorism. When it comes to religion for the Ukrainian Crimean Tatars, their practices really remain very basic. And let us say that it is more of an identity marker than a dogmatized belief system. When we look at Crimean Tatars, its identity is primary political, based on common attitude toward our history of en masse deportation by Stalin in 1944, return to Crimea, anti-communism, pro-democratic government, institutions, and justices, etc. The head of the Center for Civil Liberties, Ms. Alexander Matvichuk, made a highly poignant observation. She indicated that when Russia starts persecuting those who protect victims of political persecution, it means that the red mark on the barometer has lit up. So this is an excellent analysis. So when we talk about persecuting of Crimean Tatars, she says, by Russia, they're saying that they're exposing terrorists. Against these background of statements, people think anxiously of Syria, of ISIS, the image of terrorists and attacks in European countries. But what Russia is actually doing is replacing the concept of combating dissent to fighting terrorism. So, and what is so disheartening about this act is that she mentions, Ms. Matvichuk mentions that it also undermines joint efforts of the international community in the actual fight against terrorism. Just last month alone, on February 17th, Crimea SOS had reported arrest and whereby the occupier searched 7 homes of Crimean Tatars. These are arbitrary searches, detentions, etc. And what was their crime? Okay, for example, Leonard Seyit Ahmet took part in delivering packages to political prisoners in detention centers. Oleg Fedorov attended political motivated trials, participated in informational campaigns in support of Crimean Tatar political prisoners. Ernest Ibrahimov, who is also an activist in Crimean Solidarity, a civic movement that I mentioned, also attended trials of political prisoners. He also delivered packages to political prisoners. Asamet Eyüpov participated in a Crimean Tatar protest on Red Square in Moscow on July 29. So these acts by the occupier is a blatant violation of norms of international humanitarian law that prohibit the imposition of criminal law of the occupying state onto the occupied territory. And this is according to the Geneva Convention. In addition, persecution of targeted group on political grounds is also a crime against humanity, according to the Rome Statute of International Criminal Court. So having just provided you a snippet of why they are being arrested, we can also perhaps ask the next question. How can Crimean Tatars, or those who want to be free in Crimea, protect themselves? Truly, they are defenseless. As long as the occupation continues, they cannot count on a peaceful and decent life. And under such circumstances, people can only maintain their honor or their desire for freedom by resisting. And so we have seen resistance in Crimea that have been nonviolent in nature. Having said this, that in fact, the role of the international community becomes very, very important. International pressure on Russia is very important. Sanctions may also prevent Russia to a certain extent, but it will not stop the repression, as Russia itself is not a democratic nation, but a repressive nation. And of course, as we've seen, that democracy is not an option for Russia today. If it is, their whole entire state system might collapse. And we have seen about a month ago some of the demonstrations and some of the opposition out there in Moscow. So just about last week, on March 12th, there was a high-level area formula meeting on Crimea hosted by Estonia with 23 co-sponsors, as well as during the February 23 General Assembly debate. Ukraine received tremendous support at this area formula, and the language was very strong in support of Ukraine's territorial integrity. And some of the UN member nations closed their statements with Crimea is Ukraine. And as a follow-up to that tremendous support that Ukraine received, Russia also held an informal meeting on March 17th. And as a response to this false narrative, the remark by Ms. Irina Solenko was very, very meaningful for the Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians as well. And I quote, it was a response to the distortion of the realities that everything is happy in Crimea, etc. She stated, and I quote, Russia is really interested in raising, if Russia is really interested in raising an understanding of the situation, it should immediately open access to Crimea to representatives of the United Nations, the OSCE, and the Council of Europe. So, followed by, thereafter shortly, we also heard a very strong statement from the ministers of the ministers of foreign affairs of G7, in which they supported Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and independence. The international Ukraine's advocacy and communication at the United Nations at the international level has truly succeeded in communicating what is happening in Crimea, and the fake news information that is released by the occupiers, along with the numerous conferences that have proved to be highly fruitful. The unity of the Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians are seen as a problem for the occupier, which is Russia, because they counter the false narrative that the annexation was unanimous and that Russia acted in accordance with the so-called will of its people. President Zelensky has of recent initiated a decree on February 21 of this year called the Crimean Platform, which is part of Ukraine's strategy on deoccupation and is a counter also against the illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. And this will take place, I believe the date that has been placed out there is August 21st of this year. And this is intended to consolidate all international efforts in the occupation and return of Ukraine's territory, and also overcoming the consequences caused by the temporary occupation by the Russian Federation, and all the resolutions, all the UNGA decisions on the issue of the Russian aggression against Ukraine has been ongoing into 2014, 2016, 2020, etc. And these resolutions really were the foundations to eventually bringing the Crimean platform into full fruition. I would like to end with just a impromptu comment, if I may. Way back when the Victims of Communism Memorial at its opening, I believe that was around 2007 or 2008, if I'm not mistaken, I had a chance to meet the former president, George W. Bush. And when I met him, of course, I mentioned that I was a Crimean Tatar, and that Ukraine was evolving into a democracy. But one of his comments that really has stayed with me, that President Bush has made back in 2001 when he made a visit in Genoa. President Bush asked, I think it was a rhetorical question, to President Putin at that time, asked, where is the heartland of Russia? And to that, I would like to respond that the heartland of Russia is not Ukraine. Thank you.